right. All right. Welcome everybody back to Brainstorm Live. You all have been so patient with me as I've transitioned to a new place and am probably behind on a lot of things, but still committed to getting us all together as much as we can. And Dr. Conroy has blessed us with her presence today, and going to just share with us about some of their research and also like the direct connection to their passion of clinical practice and being a practitioner scientist, as I said earlier. So, Dr. Conroy, well, just a reminder, I think Dr. Conroy is going to do a little bit of a presentation for 30 minutes. We'll do a more formal Q&A, and then as always, we'll stick around if anybody wants to for some informal dialogue afterwards. So, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Well, it's so good to see everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I've been really looking forward just to sharing this conversation. And I know everyone might do it a little bit differently, but I'm just going to say go ahead and use the chat box. Like if a question comes up in real time, I can't promise that I'll see it in the moment, but at least it'll give us like a bookmark to return to. So if something pops up in the moment, don't hesitate to use that. Just because I do want today to feel interactive. I'm really passionate about this research. I'm excited to share it with you all, but definitely want it to be a dialogue today. So I will share my screen with you all. Because what we're going to be talking about today is this idea of taking psychophysiological measurements in order to gauge therapeutic effectiveness. Like Eric said, I do consider myself kind of practitioner first. I absolutely love getting to work with my clients. I love getting to watch their journeys toward healing and wholeness and more adaptive and flexible functioning. That it really is just the thing that I'm most passionate about. But I also love that this field allows us to wear a few different hats. So I'm also part of a research team for our Arkansas EFT Center. We're about to launch some really exciting projects in the fall that I'll share a little bit about. And I really love to teach it and share what I've learned, and I've done that kind of in an adjunct capacity. But I really love that this type of research allows me to kind of combine all three, all three of these roles that I love so much. And so I'm really looking forward to sharing that with you. So just a look at what we're going to be focusing in on today is first understanding the relationship between physiology, psychophysiology, and emotional regulation. Really kind of clarifying kind of what those underpinnings are, and then kind of talking about some appropriate therapeutic models and the dependent variables in research that allow for effective study to be done. And then we're going to walk through an example of what this looked like through some research that a team of academics and clinicians conducted here in Arkansas that I'm excited to share with you. And that one focused on this idea of co-regulation and emotionally focused therapy. And then I just want to talk about this line of research overall and the way that it's my hope that ultimately that yes, it benefits the field and the practitioners that are in the trenches with it, but also that it gives us a new way to advocate for mental health care, especially as our systems are so dependent upon managed care, that the accessibility of so many resources are dependent on that coverage. Well, what are ways that we can move forward with that sense of advocacy? But like I said, what we're really going to focus on today, how do we use that physiological research to kind of give us insight into therapeutic effectiveness, which forces us to start in this place of how would we define that idea of therapeutic effectiveness? And maybe as you think about that term, there's a bunch of different things that can come to mind, but it's really hard to gauge, uh, what we're trying to look at and what we're trying to establish if we don't have a clear definition for how we're effective in the mental health field as it pertains to therapy specifically. And so maybe when you think about that idea of effectiveness, maybe kind of more adaptive thought patterns come up, maybe a more cohesive sense of self, maybe this idea of greater self-esteem, that all of those things maybe rise to the surface, or different behavior patterns that, according to the model that you most align with, right, that's going to have a big influence on the way we define this idea of effectiveness. But for me, in the research that I've done, I think the thing that has stuck out the most is this idea of emotional regulation. And basically, this idea of emotional regulation says that how capable is an individual of detecting, assessing, and changing their emotional responses according to a path that's going to best help them meet the goals that they have for themselves. I really would recommend, even though it's stood the test of time for me, an article by Thompson that really talks about and clarifies this idea of emotional regulation happens on a conscious level, yes, that we can be aware of, but also a subconscious level, right? And so, according to this theory around emotional regulation, the goal of therapeutic treatment is to expand an individual's capacity to regulate their own emotions in a way that's going to produce more adaptive, less rigid functioning. And so, if we're to gauge what does it mean to be effective from a therapeutic standpoint, right? That from this perspective, what we're really asking is, how effectively can counseling expand an individual's capacity for emotional regulation, right? And that this is especially relevant for those of you in clinical practice that are just as aware as I am that there are major deficiencies in emotional regulation correlated with most of the presenting mental health disorders that we see. And so looking to expand their capacity to regulate really has the power to make a lot of changes for a variety of presenting clients. I thought that this was a really helpful, we won't go super into this, but just a helpful reminder of the ways that our regulation is really dependent upon kind of these areas of the brain that's what facilitates it. So you can see on the left side here that this is kind of a brain at resting state at a baseline. It wouldn't be considered upregulated. It wouldn't be considered downregulated in a relaxed state, right? That these are like the emotional parts of the brain that are still lit up, but not with as much activity or intensity. And that in an upregulated state, as you can see on the top right there, that we see that shift in color, right? As there's more activity being experienced on both in the prefrontal cortex, but also on that deeper, more primal levels, right? That we see a lot of activation in those places, but we do still see a sense of activity in that bottom right as well, that down regulation, that those are different colors in this graphic because they kind of simulate different types of activity that are taking place, right? But what I really wanted this to emulate is that our ideas of emotional regulation obviously are not just emotional. They're not just conceptual, right? They're correlated, right, with specific activity in the brain, which ultimately triggers resultant, like, cascading effects in the body. And that's where we get this idea of physiological constructs, that when there is increased activity in these specific parts of the brain, there is a change in the body's physiological constructs that we've found to be true. So some of these physiological measurements include respiration rates, right? Our pace of breathing, blood pressure, heart rate. Galvanic responses are really like the electrical current across the surface of the skin, that all of these are different measures of stress. All of these have been shown that changes are made whenever we look at when someone is in an upregulated state versus a downregulated state. And I see, Kai, your question, curious what other parts of the brain show activation during up and down regulation. That is a great question. Here, we'll go back here to this part. So I think, and please define emotional. So again, this is very much according to, there's a lot of different theories out there of what that means by emotional, what parts of the brain. I think initially when this came out, people were really looking for a simple solution, right? Of tell me the really specific parts of the brain, right? Tell me exactly what lights up, right? And we were trying to like pinpoint it, right? Of these are the specific areas, these are the specific ways that they're activated. And I think what emerging research has shown is it's a lot more complicated than that. That when there's like a flood of stress, and I'll get to the question too around emotion, that basically the current theory that feel like is most predominant now really points to emotions being signals, right? And I predominantly ascribe right to a more polyvagal theory, that that's one that I'm most familiar with. This idea that kind of our brain is always scanning, right, for a sense of safety, right? And that emotions are the response. They're the signals that our brain sends out to the rest of our body. They don't just stay within the brain, right? When a threat is detected, right? Or when a sign of safety is detected, or somewhere that kind of exists on that spectrum, right? Just to communicate to the body, there's a change that needs to be made, right? I'm enjoying this, I can relax, right? It's really a signal that's sent to the rest of the body that's kind of a newer way to view that sense of emotion, is not just putting them in categories, right? But it's a signal that the body is sending according to the level of safety that it detects is present, and result to a specific stimuli. And so kind of your question, right, of, okay, what are the specific areas that sometimes it can depend on like the level of upregulation that's present, right? That if it's a brief stimulus and it's not terribly threatening, right, that I can still have a lot of my prefrontal cortex activated, right? And that maybe there's some more like limbic functioning that's present, which is, I think, utilized as a term to say, okay, here's a general way so that I don't have to pinpoint a specific part of the brain, because there's several that are activated according, right, to the person's level of stimulation that they've had before, right? That's relevant to the current level of safety that they're experiencing. So unfortunately, there isn't just a clear-cut answer, right? That with most of the field, it's a very much it depends on kind of the level of stimulation present. Because when we see greater stimulation, like in those moments where it feels like I'm in a life-threatening situation, that's where we see kind of prefrontal cortex shut down. It's really only like the more primal parts of the brain that are responding. And so this is just kind of a study that was done on a more um, general, right, like a simulated upregulation, downregulation. That's why you're not seeing, or you're still seeing activity in the prefrontal cortex, because this is done in a lab setting where people know that they're safe, they know that their life isn't in danger, and that's why you're seeing this type of activity here. And so with that being said, though, the way that we would kind of best simulate that, um, maybe it's a confirmation. Yes, our I'm so glad that you said that, Kai. Because they are, right? And through this lens, right, it's kind of appreciating this whole body experience that's taking place. And that's what psychophysiology really tends to do is, okay, how can we use these constructs, right, to maybe draw inferences, especially about the stress response that's taking place. And advocates of psychophysiology say that we're attempting to limit the interference with an individual's natural functioning, especially with the technology we have now. There are sensors that can be worn that are easy to forget about, or wristbands, right, that aren't as intrusive, that they may not be as aware. Um, there's also advocates that say that this offers a more objective measure of reactivity than purely self-evaluation, because it gives us kind of hard and fast numbers. And we'll talk a little bit about the nuance within that it's not always the case and it's not that clear cut. But really, this is what the proponents of psychophysiology are really pushing toward, that this can really be an effective way to appreciate the whole body experience that is emotional regulation, right? And give us an objective measure that's maybe harder for clients, especially to evaluate, in order to give us a clear picture of how the person's experiencing holistically. So, with this idea, right, if we're going to use this idea of emotional regulation to measure therapeutic effectiveness, what we're really trying to say is, okay, how can we use physiological data that's coming in to give us indications on an individual's emotional regulation capacities, right? How easily are they upregulated? Over time, do they show more trends toward being capable of downregulation at a faster rate? That physiological measures can really offer a way to do that. And yes, Laura, so helpful, right? Because especially for practitioners in the room, I don't need to remind you of when you ask, like, how does that make you feel? What's going on for you as you talk about that? And they say, I don't know. Like, and that I don't know is like, okay, are you being difficult? Are you hiding? It always like feels like it's personal. Um, but what that's really saying is, okay, how can we use this data, just like you're saying, to really understand what's going on internally. Even if I'm not able to find words, there's something happening in my body that can give me an indication as a clinician, right, of what's happening internally. And Emily, that galvanic response is mostly it's talking about like the electrical current that runs over the surface of the skin, that in moments of stress, that can be increased. Here it is at the bottom of this, that galvanic responses. When someone's really stressed, that they can increase that electrical current. That's a natural response. It kind of mobilizes a person. So that's seen as another measure of physiology that has some psychological implications. Yes, due to sweat secretions. Thank you, Eric. Okay, and then so with this idea, right, if we're going to use emotional regulation to gauge this idea of therapeutic effectiveness, give us more insight into what's going on into the counseling process, physiological data can, depending on the research question at hand, can give us a lot of insight into how the client is responding to treatment. It not with perfect clarity, right, just like any other research, but it can give us an additional measure to really understand the whole body experience of clients. And I'm definitely not the first person to talk about the idea of physiological measurements in literature. I want to make sure that's very clear, that that's not an original thought, but doing it through a specific theory. Is kind of the new idea that we're introducing here. And so, how do we specifically use it, and which is already recommended within literature, right? That this article back in 2017 was talking about how do we use this data and interpret it through the lens of clinical theory in order to do and apply that theory with more clarity, to kind of firm up that application as it presents with clients. And they specifically isolate theoretical models that are operationalized. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that is in just a second. And this article as well, this one does a great job. This Detsleben article really hits on how necessary it is to exercise caution in this data interpretation due to all the extraneous factors that impact our physiological response to anything, right? So even time of day, that for the most part, our heart rate tends to be at its highest about 2 hours after we wake up. Maybe some of you feel that, maybe some of you don't. But that maybe is where you're most productive or you're most focused, or that's when a lot of us are kind of getting our days started, that maybe you feel that kind of burst of energy, and they tend to dip around 2 o'clock. Maybe you have felt that for like a post-lunch drop-off. And so things like that, being aware of kind of those overall trends, and the ways that that affects our physiological functioning. Obviously, changes in diet. If there's more glucose present in the system, then things are going to be kind of upregulated a little bit. So what is really encouraged is, one, taking a lot of data to make sure that we're not drawing too many conclusions on too small of a subset, right? But also just appreciating all the variability, looking to restrict that variability as much as possible when we're looking in that research. So I include this to say, if you are to come across an article like this, right, just getting curious about how are they kind of appreciating the context of those extraneous factors and making sure to account for those. But overall, what I think is so inspiring, the existing literature around psychophysiology and therapy just really kind of tends to look at like a before and after. Maybe if you've read like Gottman's Love Lab research, right, that they talk a lot about using those physiological measurements, kind of tracking the interactions between partners, that maybe you've seen research like that. But what the push for now, and what we're going to go into with the article that we describe, is how do we really overlay physiological data with maybe a more operationalized counseling process to really understand and increase our awareness of how the body, right, is impacted by therapy, so we can maybe understand with a little bit more clarity why it works and how we can improve it, and how we can improve that idea of therapeutic effectiveness. So our study specifically we'll get into kind of the model that was used, but one of the ones that is more recommended in existing literature is, if we can find models that are really structured and operationalized, that they may have the potential to yield more clinical implications, right? And so if there's, a stage 2 of this model, right? Or if it's like, this is my time in EMDR to really apply this meditative practice, right? To try to down regulate, that models that are more structured in that sense really can maybe draw more clear conclusions and find clearer trends of this is what tends to happen during this part of the change process, that we can kind of isolate the phases of the change process to understand what happens on a physiological level with more clarity. And then we can also isolate, even the idea of interventions, that when a therapist applies this intervention at this stage in the process, this is maybe what it tends to have. It's not that less structured models are off the table, right? But that they just tend to be able to answer different research questions. So less structured models, maybe that are more humanistically oriented, that maybe are more client directed, of what they're coming in with, can still demonstrate, right, the changes and flexibility and emotional regulation over time. So those are more likely to yield results that are like a before and after study. Like if a client experiences a pretty intense anxiety or phobia around a particular stimulus, can I present that stimulus before they start treatment, right? And gauge their level of upregulation there. And then can I compare that at the end? That less structured models can still utilize this type of data. It just can't pinpoint with as much clarity the change process itself. And then obviously, my last point here on this slide, just like for any other research, different data analyses are going to be used to interpret different questions, research questions that are being asked. There is not one size fits all for the data analysis, but it does require a little bit more complicated analyses. The research example that we're going to go into, we took 3,000 data points for each participant within a given hour, because we're looking to look for trends over time. And so obviously, if we're taking physiological measurements, those change moment by moment. So we're going to need to choose analyses that are able to kind of summarize, right, that trend over time, to summarize and take into account the average, that it can just get a little bit more complicated there because we're kind of appreciating a greater data set. So in this particular study, we were looking at emotionally focused therapy. And I'm not sure everyone's familiarity with this model, but basically the bread and butter of it is this idea of co-regulation. That essentially what it says is that people are better able, it comes out of attachment theory primarily, and just looks for a practical way to apply that in session. And it says, how can we build a sense of co-regulation through secure attachment? How can a counselor facilitate that through a dyad? Primarily, but also in individual work, but it kind of got its start in couples therapy, that how can we build a secure attachment between this couple? Because if they're able to co-regulate with one another, they're going to be more equipped to individually self-regulate. So with co-regulation being at the heart of it, we were looking for what are the co-regulatory effects that we can measure physiologically throughout the course of the EFT process. And EFT was a fitting model for this line of research because it is highly operationalized. It was developed by Dr. Sue Johnson in the 90s from her watching a lot of client tape, and clients that were shown to improve over time and demonstrated evidence of increased flexibility and hypothetically emotional regulation over time. That what her and her team did was really look at, okay, what is the change process that we can document here as we watch this tape? What is therapy consisting of? What are the trends consisting of? And because she developed this out of the research, that it came out with pretty formal steps and stages. So there are indicators of where the client is in the process, what stage they're in, and then what steps the counselor should be taking to walk them through closer to that sense of secure attachment and increased regulation capacity. And so that made it a good candidate for this line of research, as we referenced before, because this structure of the model allowed it for a lot of coded analysis for the data that was collected. So for this specific study, we recruited a single couple who wore wristbands that monitored their heart rates and a few other physiological measurements during 8 sessions that were done with a certified EFT trainer. Myself and a certified EFT supervisor then watched all of those videos and coded them according to timestamps and specifically tracking through when did we hit what steps and stages so that we could overlay that with the physiological data that was collected. And like I said, the purpose of this study wasn't necessarily to gauge, okay, what is, beginning and ending emotional regulation? How did that shift over time? But it's saying, okay, from an EFT perspective, we're looking to capture this idea of co-regulation, which is ultimately how in sync is the couple with one another in their emotional responsiveness during the course of the counseling session. So we use what's called a surrogate synchrony analysis. Like I said, we took 3,000 data points over the course of an hour-long session for both members of this couple. And what this analysis allows us to do is kind of put a number to how they're trending together. So when one member of the couple became upregulated, so did the other, right? And when one experienced some downregulation and kind of coming down off that state, they experienced that together. How in sync are they also? And yes, Laura, absolutely. To a parent-child, this idea of co-regulation, and this is from an EFT perspective, is a little bit different because we hope that there is a limit maybe to how much the child is co-regulating the parent, right? That yes, we want to see that level of, especially like from a secure attachment perspective, that the parent is really able to offer that sense of safety and co-regulation kind of coming up with them so that they can better calm themselves, right? But that we get into some sticky territory that we're all aware of the abounding research on that, right? If a child feels the need to regulate a parent. And so it does still apply, right? There are some ways, I have an 18-month-old at home right now, and when I rock him to sleep at night still, I feel more regulated, right? And so it definitely still applies, but there are some nuances because it's not as bi-directional as it would be between partners, if that makes sense. And so with that, in this particular study where we are looking at a single couple, we were looking at, okay, especially as they share and kind of upregulate over the course of session, how is that being influenced in one another? Um, I know that Eric either has shared the article or will, and we also explore this idea of a lag time that takes place between them, and so saying, okay, it obviously I experience something in my body, but my partner can't fully experience that until I process it, right? And I can put that into words to where they're able to have their own experience of it. But ultimately, what our results of the study found was that when sessions were primarily focused on primary emotions, basically more vulnerable emotions. In EFT, we call these attachment injuries, their bonds, their longings for the relationship, maybe even some unmet attachment needs from childhood that were discussed. That we saw a lot of correlation with significant heart rate synchrony between the couple. And these, again, with our coding process, this is kind of step 3 and 5 of the EFT process. And then we also found, which makes sense in conjunction with that, that sessions that were more focused on kind of identifying the client's patterns of functioning with one another, kind of using a cognitive reframe for the relationship, which is really centered on externalizing the conflict that takes place, which is step 2 and 4 of the EFT process, that those were correlated with less significant heart rate synchrony between the couple. So essentially what our research found is the more cognitively focused sessions yielded less synchronicity between the couple, while sessions that elicit a greater empathic response produce more physiological synchrony between the two. And from an EFT perspective, it's actually really necessary. It doesn't mean that we should just throw out all the cognitive stuff and skip right to the co-regulation, right? That the purpose, right, of steps 2 and 4 is to help organize, is help to create, a level of safety and understanding, and that work maybe not it may not be the most emotional, right, cathartic, like therapy moments that we love to see with the tears, but right, it yields enough safety, right, where we can kind of build a framework that's sturdy enough to hang those more cathartic experiences on over the course of counseling. So our earlier sessions, I believe it was 1, 2, 3, and 5, were the ones that were more focused on 2 and 4, and then the others, 3, 3, 6, 7, and 8 were more emotionally focused on those primary responses, and that's where we saw the greater levels of synchrony between them. And this is honestly my favorite part of this entire line of research is I get to ask this question. What does this research mean for sessions? I love pulling in psychoed to my sessions with counselor or with clients. I love being able to reference, when I'm talking about this idea of memory reconsolidation. Here's what our scans of our brain show us about what we assume is happening when we do this intervention. Here's what we've seen and what we know about the brain in a more relaxed state, right? That I can kind of make these inferences. Um, but I love that research like this helps me to be a little bit more tailored, right, to what is actually happening in the counseling process. And yes, I did too. We had a really great clinician. And also the couple wasn't uh as distressed as some other couples that we've seen in the process. So they were really great to work with and relatively new in their relationship. So I think that's why we also saw a lot of change in only 8 sessions. And Laura, I see your question here. Might a knowledgeable parent be able to intentionally impact a child's regulation? Oh, absolutely. And not even just a knowledgeable parent, but I think the word I might use there is just an attuned parent, right? One that really sees their child's level of experiencing, right? And an attuned parent, right? can get dysregulated in themselves really easily and think about this is my fault or what's happening for them, or kind of get wrapped up in their own shame, right? But I think an attuned parent is able to help regulate their child's experience, right, of just being sad with them when something doesn't go their way, right? And just being able to hold that space and in that process of co-regulation, right, from the parent to the child, right? It teaches the child how to down regulate in the safe way because they have this stronger, wiser, and this is borrowed from attachment research from Bowlby, right? But by having a safer, stronger, wiser other walk me down from that upregulated state, right? I teach my system then how to downregulate. And Laura, I am very interested in talking to you during the Q&A because I can tell you do a lot of family work. So I'd love to hear and talk more with you about how that applies there because those are really great questions. And so what this research means for our actual sessions, I love that because this kind of looks at specific interventions and specific steps and stages of the EFT process, we're able to provide really tailored feedback to our training community here. And again, we're taking this with a grain of salt. We're saying, okay, here's kind of what measurements show. It's not conclusive, but maybe it gives us a clearer idea that we're hoping to expand on in future research. But our training group has taken the data from this and then been able to kind of encourage and support counselors in their specific sessions, right? And so some ways that we've done that is, it's been really encouraging for clinicians to see, okay, there is a actual physiological impact of the interventions that I'm applying. Right, that this is like a full body experience. Eric was saying before, where we watch the leg move in session, right? And we know what it means, but how do we kind of measure that and what's that mean for the whole body, right? That putting numbers to that, right, is really helpful. And specifically, right, understanding how, and this is kind of what our team hopes to clarify moving forward, how specific interventions have an impact on heart rate increases or other stress measures, right? What kind of impact when I apply this specific intervention? It might be the 10th time that I've done it today with all the clients that I'm seeing, right? But by putting numbers to say, oh, this is what my client's heart rate does, though, when I ask them to do this intervention, right? It helps me to be more attuned and honor the risk that I'm asking of my client when I have the physical numbers to say, even if I see nothing on the surface, right? This is what's going on internally. It's also, in addition to kind of promoting, right, just that sense of empathy for what it feels like to be a client in treatment. It also has allowed us to suggest to clients that they consider how do we slow down a bit more during those empathically charged, really responsive moments of co-regulation between them. We use the phrase like, how do we squeeze all the juice? Basically, out of those moments where a couple is really in sync, right? When we're talking about this idea of attachment longings and the way that they want to be close and the pain that comes from the fear of not being close, how do we slow those down? Right, to make sure that we're squeezing all that we can out of those moments to really maximize that potential for co-regulation, that's been a powerful clarifying point for them. And then the final point that we've really utilized during our trainings to kind of change the way that our community thinks about EFT and engaging with clients is using kind of the differences between the asynchronous and the synchronous moments in session. How do we understand those as complementing one another? If we just push way too hard for primary emotion, we don't teach them how to downregulate, right? And we need to teach them how to downregulate. We need this balance. A mentor of mine calls it this idea of pendulation, right? Between the two, we need to kind of walk them into deeper waters, and then we need to spend time organizing it so we're not just leaving them in chaos, right? And that's what the data showed too, that we kind of vacillated between these really asynchronous moments and into more synchrony. And we went back and forth because that allows us to have a more steady progression toward co-regulation. And so that's what I really love about this research is it gives us more clarity of how to sit with our clients. And that's what I'm really passionate about, kind of bridging that gap between practice and the line of research that's being done. And our team loved it so much that we are looking to continue this research. So I mentioned that our team is looking to launch a really big research project this fall. And what we really want this data collection to focus on is we're going to be using some wristbands again, and we're going to be actually surveying the client's perception of their experience in session, and seeing what kind of correlation exists between the actual physiological data that's being shown. So, we kind of talk about how much can we trust these self-evaluative measures, and we want to kind of understand with more clarity what is that correlation? Do the clients notice these things? How are they making sense of those changes if they do pick up on them? That we're looking to get a survey going for that. We're also looking to throw another wristband into the mix, and put one on the counselor to understand how are they upregulated or downregulated during the course of a session. What impact does that have on co-regulation with those clients? And kind of giving counselors more clarity too of what goes on for them in session, so that maybe we can even suggest some grounding techniques, some helpful ways just to approach that. We've also been working really hard to develop a new coding system that we're really excited to roll out, that really isolates, like I said before, interventions specifically at different points of the change process so that we can understand, okay, when they work and when they help downregulate, what's being done, right? How are they being done? Let's put more words to that so that we can really try to provide counselors with more clarity of how to walk clients through the change process. Yes, Lisa, that is so well said. And that obviously using those implications, right, for new counselors, but also for seasoned counselors too, right? That we all need that level of clarity, and that's something we're excited about too, is that coding those interventions, we're actually using those with supervisees for a different way to kind of approach their work and how they're conceptualizing the process with more clarity. Yes, and how it impact oh, Laura, so well said, right? That is really what I'm looking for. When I get dysregulated in session, I know my clients notice. When I'm sweating, I know they probably pick up on parts of that, right? And so how can we capture that sense? Right, not just to shame counselors and remind them how human they really are, but right, so that we can normalize that experience for counselors, because it's okay to get dysregulated. It's okay to be impacted by what's happening in session, right? Reminding them of that, but how can we use that data, right, to establish a sense of regulating themselves even. And so really, really well said. Okay, and then this is kind of my dream for what this research does. By integrating this idea of physiology with mental health care, can we promote a more holistic approach to wellness with this biopsychosocial emphasis? And this is why it offers a different level of advocacy, specifically for managed care systems. If we can really push the resources we have to show, mental health care really does promote these physical changes in the body, right? We see these changes in blood pressure over time. We see these differences, right, in metabolic rates over time, right? Because we believe in that, right, as counselors, that it's kind of been a challenge for us of how do we break down this mind-body dualism, right? That really just prevents and kind of adds a barrier to accessing mental health resources that aren't there for other types of healthcare. And so it really is my hope that if we can use more theories to explore more links to that, we're going to open more doors of the coverage that managed care provides, so that the research that we're working so hard toward doesn't just benefit a person that is of a certain status, of a certain privilege level or ability, that we're really looking to use this data right on a larger scale to impact the field as a whole and especially promote more accessibility for a wide range of people. That I think that taking physiological data has its fair share of nuances, right? That we can't just interpret with perfect clarity, just like a lot of our research, right? But it can be utilized in a different way to advocate and provide that sense of legitimacy, because unfortunately, managed care is very much the world that we're living in. And yes, Laura, absolutely. That using the physiological, I didn't touch on that, but I think that that's so important. We can also use this data, right, to validate the client's experience, to normalize their experience. It's okay, this is hard, right? And especially, I remember you saying, that the client that doesn't know, and this part wasn't included in the article, and it's something that we're hoping to build on. But EFT also puts forth this idea that there's typically one partner that has more avoidant regulatory tendencies in most couples, that they maybe aren't as aware of their emotions. They're better at tuning them out for whatever reason that may be. And that we saw in looking at the data that it was typically the partner with a more avoidant coping strategy tended to have a greater lag time on their emotional processing speed. That it took them longer to catch up with where their partner was given a stimulus, right? And so we can normalize that for clients. It's okay to not know. How would you know, right? Your body is doing so much to make sense of this. It's okay, right, to take time, that we can give our clients another way to see you're not failing in this process, right? Which promotes their engagement and the level of safety that they perceive to be present in the room with us. Really beautiful point there. It has the potential to benefit clients as well. And Kai, we'll have to talk. I like the sound of that. And so I just ultimately want to say thank you. I love talking about this. It has been an incredible challenge to delve into the world of physiology and a few grad level courses that I did not anticipate adding to my resume when I was in my doc program. But it has just been so enjoyable, right, to kind of push and to develop this more holistic response of people, and what goes on for them in the change process. And I think this is what it's looked like for me. And this is the way that I've kind of channeled that passion of wanting to learn and grow and to kind of push a leading edge in our field. And it's okay if that's not a fit for you, but I think the questions that I really wanted to leave us with, is what aspects of research are most mentally stimulating for me. I know I said I'm practitioner first, but I'm familiar enough with academia to know that research opportunities are often about like who wants to me to do what and do I have most accessibility to. But even if it's not feasible right now, just to be aware of kind of where your curiosities and your passions kind of push you, but also thinking what are the really practical ways to channel those passions into the clinical setting, right? That how can we really see a difference in the way that we're applying, and increasing that level of accessibility to mental health recipients, clients or others, consumers of whatever resources. That's really kind of my push behind this, or what are ways that we can kind of continue to bridge this gap between what's happening in session and in practice, and kind of the accessibility that we have to research, because the more that we can bridge that gap, right, everybody benefits, just like the comments were saying, right? Families and couples and individuals and clients and clinicians and managed care systems, that's just so much potential for change there. That's what I've enjoyed most about this process. So thank you for letting me share, and thank you for your engagement too in the chat. And I We'll stop sharing my screen. And so I know that I answered questions along the way, and so maybe they're a little bit less. But I just wanted to open up if there are any more questions or any more places that we want to go. That I'm more than welcome to opening that up. Yeah, Sarah, I see your hand.
Yeah, I would think doing your research for your dissertation that you were under a review board, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Did you and the university provide the wristbands to the clients?
Yeah, so oh, great question. Thanks for clarifying, Sarah. Yeah, so we obtained the wristbands through grant funding. That this was not the only project that they were used in. And so yes, I met the couple every time, and we took like a baseline study or a baseline measurement just to see kind of what they were starting with at the start before every session, and then I would be there after the session to collect them. So it wasn't wristbands that the clients had themselves.
Okay. And my follow-up question is because I do a lot of mindfulness interventions, and notice that some of my clients have on Apple Watches and different types of health monitoring devices. But since I'm not in a study, I'm just a clinician in front of a client, is there, and I'm just putting it out there for everyone to kind of help me understand, is there any ethical boundary that I would have to be aware of if I ask the client to, hey, could you take some readings?
Hmm. I think that's a great question. And I think, especially depending on the framework that's done in, probably maybe not recording those anywhere, right? But what do you notice about yourself, especially if the client is highly motivated? I find that kind of assigning things like that is really helpful for them in their process. They feel really engaged, right? And a part. And so just some like nuances in that, and I didn't include this, but there were some like health variabilities that the client may not feel comfortable sharing. And so I think that that's a consideration, right? That there are a few different heart conditions that can produce some really variable results that we had to make sure that our participants did not have, just because it isn't as straightforward, and really wanting to make sure that clients don't get discouraged if they're not seeing the results that they want to, of like, I'm doing the right thing, like why isn't my heart rate coming down? Right, that can kind of send them into a more upregulated space. So I really would think it would depend on the client and kind of what they would do with that data. Right. And if they would use that to kind of monitor, engage themselves, and then it might be a more stressful thing versus this is a way I'm kind of participating in my treatment process. That I think that for me, there would be another, like, it depends, but I'll feel free to open that up to everyone else as well, because I think that's a great idea.
Yes, and this will bleed into a question for you, Julie, in a second, but I think consent's important in any assessment method. So I think as long as you can kind of document consent, just like you would if you were giving a back depression inventory, I wouldn't consider it any differently than any of the other tests that we already use, or, simple self-monitoring. You might ask a client to, document each time this happens to you throughout the week or something like that. So for me, it's no different than that, just because it's a technological measure. The method and the intention, I think, is still there. Um, and being careful that we're not overstating the results. That's probably where your boundaries of competence would get challenged, is if you start saying, oh, you have this heart condition, blah, blah, blah. Well, you're not a cardiologist.
Just lost you.
Yeah. I hit my space bar. Can you hear me now?
You're back now.
Yes.
Yeah, hit my darn space bar. Who would have known that was a shortcut? That's where I think you get into some ethical gray areas. The other piece, this is a question for you, Julia, too, is I think one of the concerns about any neuroscience research that uses physiological measurement is lack of reporting on reliability and validity statistics, sampling rates, because they're consumer grade materials like Apple Watches, like heart math, and then there are medical grade devices that, you know, have much higher sampling rates, much higher reliability and validity. So one, did you all have access to the reliability and validity information for the wristbands that y'all used? Okay, and
Yeah,
what?
and we did use medical grade wristbands. They were originally developed for clients that are patients that are at high risk for seizures.
Yeah,
So they will actually like notify, like the more specialized models will notify like, hey, a seizure conditions are prime, right? Get safe.
right.
But with the version that we had, so it did report those kind of consistent or like the changes in reliability that we would want to be aware of. And that was a big part of us taking that baseline measurement right before the session started, just kind of understanding. And luckily the analysis that we used really is just looking at the degree of trends
Yeah,
over time, right? So it kind of
Right.
allowed for a sense of variability in that sense.
yeah. So sampling rate is
Just like
something
we,
that to be important. Like if you're looking into devices, look into sampling rate, and if they don't report it, it's probably hidden somewhere. But sampling rate would be an important something if you're looking into any devices.
Absolutely.
right. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Sarah.
Julia, excuse me.
Hey,
You
Laura.
probably said this already, but could you repeat, if you did, what information you get from the wristbands? I know you get heart rate, galvanic also.
Yes, we like the skin conductance level, or it's called like electrodermal activity, EDA. We also took skin temperature and then blood pressure.
Okay. And I assume you have a long list of rule outs for things that can impact those variables in a person. You know, how much coffee they had this morning, if they're allergic to their shirt, if they slept well last night, medication they're on, all that stuff. It must be a very long list, right? Just to make sure that the information you're getting is relevant to what you're looking for.
Yes, absolutely. There's a reason we had one couple. And it was that we had a high list of exclusion factors. And that this couple did meet all of those and you know, needing to appreciate I didn't want to have a study where it's like, what'd you eat today? Right. And give me all the sugar information and give me every like milligram of caffeine you've taken in. That was a hard part, right? Because we're just needing to accept some of that variability, just to make it feasible for people to participate. But one thing that we did keep really consistent was the time of day that the couple was seen at. It was every week at this specific time, no flexing, no budging around that. That was one of our greatest ways to kind of minimize variability there. Tuesdays at 9 a.m. I was ready to slap those wristbands on. And then with that, right, that a way that we kind of accounted for that sense of variability was again taking that baseline right at the beginning, because the data that we were looking for wasn't just what did heart rate do and how much did it change, but how much were they changing together, right, over time, right, given how in sync they were during that baseline process of just sitting in the room. That what we were measuring in this wasn't just what was the change in it, right, but how in sync were they, right? And so that was a way that we thought to kind of minimize that we're just looking for the degree of change of when I go up, you go up, right? And that we're trending together. But that is something really important to consider of how do we mitigate all those variables, right, as much as we possibly can and still get people to participate. That is the question. Yeah, thanks, Laura. And thanks for all your thoughtful considerations about how this applies to family relationships too, because I think that is a very, very important piece. A little bit more complicated because it's not as bi-directional, right? But so important for us to put numbers and words to as well.
I have a a question, and forgive me, I know it may be a bit unfair, but this is an excellent presentation, by the way. And I found myself thinking of wondering in ways that a person with something like somatic symptom disorder might be able to use something like this, or how a clinician could use this in session. And I know it's not on the path that you were taking, but do you have any ideas about it?
Well, I think that that's such a great question. And can you help me with your name? Is it Keishan?
Patient, yes.
That smile tells me that's not the first time that you've been asked that. And so thank you for your patience, Keishan, and me getting clarity there. So yeah, with that, and you said with the somatic, specifically with the somatic experiencing disorders. That is a great question. And I do, gosh, and I'm not sure if you come from a more clinical background, but I'm assuming that you do with that question. And I hate to use this cop out because I just sound like every professor I had in grad school, but it really depends, right, on the client. And I would think, okay, if a client is in a really disorganized state where they just need to make sense of what's going on, right, and they need some sort of clarity and something to hold on to, right, just because they feel so confused, right, that could give them like a level of clarity of kind of feeling more grounded and more aware of what's happening in their body, right? But if a client's really wrestling with feeling out of control and what's wrong with me and why can't I get this in check and why can't that clients that present kind of in that framework, seeing data that they don't really have control over may just exacerbate those symptoms, right? Of kind of shaming and why can't I control myself? And so I think those are kind of the two things that I would think to gauge first of how a client is presenting, right? If that could be helpful. One, it can help them feel more grounded in their body, right? By referencing this research, maybe even like Sarah suggested, kind of checking in with themselves or being more aware of their body, like that could help them feel more in tune with themselves, right? Or these are general trends that we see, right? But people that are maybe struggling with how out of control that they feel, they could maybe wrestle with that a little bit more. That could exacerbate. So I'm sorry to say it depends, right?
No, but it helped clarify and streamline my thinking. So thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for asking that, Keisha.
I'd like to answer that question if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
In a different perspective, you know, we can think of these somatic disorders as another layer of emotion dysregulation. And it's sometimes, you know, we can conceptualize our emotions as a sensory imprint of a past trauma or a past scary situation that we had. And sometimes our physical symptoms are simply a reverberation of that past experience. So it's like a sensory imprint upon a sensory imprint. I don't know if that helps, but but it's a way to think about that. Actually, those somatic representations can be a person's baseline, sort of, you know, that maybe we want to get them below.
No, the layering of approaches, it does help me. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great point. Thank you so much, Kai. Yeah, go ahead, Laura.
I came directly out of a session to this presentation. The session was with an adult who's neurodiverse. And during the session, we figured out a task that my client would take on immediately after the session. In the meantime, even though it was, you know, telehealth, I was in hyper observation of my client. And I asked them what their plan was immediately after, and they told me. And I got body language, vocal language. And I asked how my client, what was going on, and my client was very tired. I asked my client, when did they get tired? It was during the session. We had a really great talk about how normal it is when you get close to something that's really uncomfortable to feel really tired and rather go do a nap than do the task afterwards. I don't exactly know why I'm saying this, but it feels like sort of without the wristband. And Dr. Beeson knows that I'm very attuned to and value hyper observation of self. I believe we can feel our own, brain changes and stuff if you learn how to do it. But as I said, you said you thought maybe I work a lot with couples. I don't really. That's way too hard for me. Too much information. But I do work mostly with adults on the spectrum. And the feedback and the information they get from their parents, often whom they live with, is part of the whole, and how seriously, how respectfully the parents hear my clients. It's all what you were talking about. So this whole presentation has been really, even though not for co-regulation, except that I do believe that we can impact our client just as a parent can impact the regulation of their child. We can impact the regulation in the moment. And I think I agree with you that even if we're not sweating, like my clients are like dogs in a brilliant way. They can smell if something's off, And if we don't know that's off with us and they do, then we get an interesting moment in the session, right? They're responding to us and we're not even aware that we're giving off something, right? Often my clients don't have the ability to answer a question about feelings. Thoughts, great. Feelings, forget it. And it's not just the lack of ability to verbalize. It's just a different way of being.
Mm-hmm.
But self-awareness, which I think is so similar to what you're talking about, baby steps toward self-awareness, right? And what happened right before you freaked out? Do you remember? Those little tiny things I think are very consistent with what you were saying. So I can't tell you how helpful it was. So fantastic.
Oh, well, Laura, I want to thank you too. I think we can all just feel how attuned you are with your client's experience, right? And they pick up on that too in the ways that you call it hyper observant, but I just use that word of attuned. It just like feels like a radio, right? That you just dial into their experience so well, right? And it feels good to feel someone on their wavelength,
Yeah,
but especially if that's not a common experience for them, that's a beautiful gift that you absolutely are
Makes such
offering.
a good point, because they aren't what gets reflected back to them so often is very shaming. I think being a birder really made this possible for me, and also spending a lot of time with animals. Really,
Oh, absolutely.
animals are geniuses, mammals.
Yeah, they don't have to get caught up in all the cognitive things that we do. They can just be present, right? And attuned in.
And respond. And one more thing and then I'll shut up. My girlfriend just slipped on the ice when she was walking her dog, broke her ankle. And she said, Charlie got down on the ground with me and lay with me. Isn't that sweet? I said, I would say it's not. Yeah, it's sweet, but it's so much more than sweet. It's, they are so attuned, that connection. And by the way, I'm in Chicago. It was like 10 below zero. So it's like the dog couldn't be wanting to get down on the ground, but it's just, we can really learn a lot from that.
Beautiful. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for sharing, Laura. That's really powerful. And thank you for the work that you do with that population that so deserves to be heard in the ways that you can tune in there.
Julia, I want to riff together for a minute. There's no preconceived answer here. Just curious your opinion, everyone else's too. A couple of things come up sometimes with physiological measurement. Sometimes there's this, at least it's been talked about, this idea of unintentional self-disclosure of like, do clients have the right to conceal? And does some advanced measurement open up this idea that it's harder for me to conceal things? And is that a part of the consent process? So let's start there.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know if I've tapped into that. I'm glad you brought it up.
Dr. Beeson, I feel like what you just said, how do I even put it? That's how I feel sometimes anyway. Like I feel like I get something about this client that they may not be comfortable that I'm getting, and so it's my responsibility. I have to be responsible about that. Be really, feedback to the client is not an automatic, and that's hardly ever, but it's so I think that what you said is really important, but I also think that it's true without a wristband.
I have a question actually about the study with the wristbands. So when you were showing that the differences in the couple of their responses, was that being measured at the beginning of the session or at the end of the session? Or
Sorry, could you repeat that?
there was the graph showing, yeah. What were the differences? Like, when was that measurement? Or
So that, again, because like I said, we took this, it's called intensive longitudinal data, and they mean intensive because so it's not just we're taking one measure, but what that ratio was really kind of saying, okay, this amount of time we were in sync, this amount of time we weren't. And so it was more a ratio that is produced by the analysis, not like a hard concrete measurement in session, because I wouldn't do that to you. Too many data points. That was more kind of capturing the ratio of in sync, out of sync moments for them.
oh, that's great. Oh,
Yeah.
because
I'm sorry. Can you
when
tell? You go
yeah.
ahead.
Yeah, no, I just want to finish this thought because of what Eric was asking about measuring what is well, calm is the word I keep coming up with. Isn't calm where we want our baseline to be? Even if, or maybe it's, what do clients want to feel? For example, if I'm excited sometimes feels like anxiety, but I want to be excited, right? So maybe there's that feeling, or maybe it is just calm. So I do a lot of somatic work. I do an approach that I'm developing with clients, and a lot of my notes are about their physical sensations. And there's so much data in their physical sensations. So I wonder if even those qualitative descriptions can be measurements.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And to extend that to what Dr. Beeson said, right, yes, I think everyone has that right, but maybe the explanation of when you're ready